You're wasting our time. People like you don't get loans here." The loan officer shoved the papers back across the marble desk. Said people like him shouldn't waste the bank's time asking for money they couldn't repay. The single father quietly gathered the papers without raising his voice. Moments later, the bank's owner walked in, and everything changed because the man they dismissed understood their entire system better than they did. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Before I show you the exact moment when the maintenance worker pointed at one blinking number and the entire executive floor went silent. Daniel Mercer didn't argue, didn't slam the desk either. He simply straightened the creased loan forms and slid them back into the worn envelope. The night maintenance technician stood there in work boots that still carried dust from the tower next door. He wasn't thinking about pride or humiliation right now. He was thinking about Lily. About the hospital invoice folded carefully inside his jacket. About the quiet way his daughter had asked that morning if the treatment would still happen. The memory tightened something deep inside his chest. Around him, the bank lobby hummed with quiet wealth. Marble floors reflected chandelier light. Men in tailored suits tapped phones and murmured about investments. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine hissed softly. Behind the counter, Caroline Drake was already calling the next customer. Her voice carried the effortless authority of someone who had never worried about money. Daniel turned slightly toward the tall digital board mounted along the lobby wall. Rows of numbers streamed across the screen like restless water. Most people never noticed those numbers. They were background noise to customers discussing mortgages and savings. But he noticed something strange. A tiny delay between two transaction updates. Just a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed almost unconsciously. Old habits were difficult to silence. Years ago, those same patterns had been his entire world. Patterns that whispered when something inside a financial system wasn't right. The board flickered again. Another brief pause between updates. Daniel exhaled slowly. Probably nothing, he told himself. Just another busy banking day. Still his gaze lingered on the glowing digits. Somewhere above the lobby elevators chimed. Doors slid open. Polished shoes stepped onto marble. Victor Halbrook had arrived. Conversations shifted instantly. Employees straightened shoulders while executives hurried toward the elevator bank owner. Daniel barely noticed. The numbers on the board flickered again. This time the delay lasted longer, a full second. Somewhere upstairs a faint alarm began chirping, soft enough that customers didn't react, but the security guard near the door looked up. Daniel followed the sound. His instincts stirred like something waking after years asleep. He knew that sound, knew what systems made it. And suddenly the humiliating loan rejection felt very far away. Because the quiet maintenance worker was already thinking about a different problem. One hidden inside those flickering numbers. A problem the people in tailored suits hadn't seen yet. The guard stepped closer to the screen. "You see that lag?" he muttered. Daniel nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I see it," and the moment he spoke something upstairs suddenly went very wrong. A sharper alarm burst through the ceiling speakers. Conversations collapsed into confusion. Employees glanced toward the elevators again. The guard grabbed his radio, operations floor report. "What's happening up there?" Static crackled back through the speaker. "Transaction freeze," someone shouted. Systems lagging everywhere. Daniel felt the old analytical machinery in his mind turn instantly. Lag meant congestion. Congestion meant something was pushing through the system too fast. His gaze returned to the streaming numbers. There it was, a repeating sequence hiding between legitimate transfers. Clever, subtle, almost invisible. Whoever built it understood banking infrastructure very well. The guard noticed Daniel's focus. "You work upstairs before?" he asked. "No," the maintenance man replied calmly. "Just seen systems like this before." The elevator doors opened again. Executives rushed out speaking in tense bursts, Caroline Drake among them. Her eyes passed over the maintenance worker without recognition. Then she looked at the board. "Why are those updates stalling?" she demanded. No one answered. Daniel watched the numbers once more. The pattern was unmistakable now, and if he was right, the bank was about to face a disaster none of them understood. He drew a slow breath. Maybe he should stay quiet. After all, they had already decided what he was worth. But the thought of Lily waiting for treatment pushed the hesitation away. Daniel stepped toward the glowing screen. "Actually," he said softly, "you're looking in the wrong place." Several executives turned sharply toward him, including Caroline Drake. The maintenance worker pointed at one blinking transaction line. "That delay," he said, "isn't random. It's being triggered on purpose," he finished quietly. The words hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. For a moment, no one moved. The maintenance worker stood beside the glowing transaction board while executives in tailored suits stared at him as if he had stepped out of the wrong world entirely. Caroline Drake folded her arms. Her expression carried the same sharp dismissal she'd used minutes earlier. "Excuse me?" she said flatly. "This is an internal banking system. Maintenance staff don't interpret financial security alerts." The man didn't flinch. "I know," he replied calmly. "But look at the intervals between the stalled updates." One of the analysts squinted at the board. Rows of transfers scrolled endlessly, green numbers sliding down the screen. At first glance it looked normal. Then the next delay happened, a small pause, barely noticeable. But now everyone saw it. Victor Halbrook stepped forward from the cluster of executives. The bank owner had arrived only moments earlier, yet the tension in the lobby had already pulled him directly into the problem. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Halbrook asked. The maintenance worker studied the numbers another second. "It's not congestion," he said. "Someone built a loop inside your transaction validation process." Silence spread again. An analyst frowned. "That's impossible. Our fraud detection monitors every transaction." The worker shook his head slightly. "Not if the transactions are layered through approved pathways first." Another pause rippled through the room. Upstairs alarms chirped again, louder this time. Somewhere above them printers whirred and phones rang with rising urgency. Omar Castillo, the bank's security supervisor, lowered his radio slowly. His eyes shifted from the transaction board to the maintenance worker standing beside it. "You saying someone's running fraud through the system right now?" Omar asked. "Not just fraud," the worker answered quietly. "A test?" Caroline Drake scoffed. "A test? Who would be testing our system by freezing transactions across multiple branches?" The maintenance worker finally turned away from the board and looked at her directly. "Someone who already knows how your monitoring software reacts." That answer didn't calm anyone. If anything, it made the room feel colder. Halbrook's gaze sharpened. "And you somehow recognize that pattern?" The worker hesitated just long enough to measure the room. Years ago, he had sat inside boardrooms like this. Rooms filled with executives who believed authority came from titles rather than understanding. He had learned something then. Never reveal everything at once. "I've seen similar exploits," he said simply. Upstairs, another alarm cut through the building. Omar's radio crackled. "Security, we've got transaction locks spreading across regional branches," a voice shouted. "Accounts freezing everywhere." Caroline Drake's confidence finally cracked. "That's not possible," she said quickly. "Our firewall isolates anomalies." The worker shook his head again. "Not if the anomaly looks legitimate." Victor Halbrook stepped closer now. The bank owner studied the maintenance technician with an intensity that silenced the room. "What's your name?" Halbrook asked. "Daniel," he replied. Halbrook glanced back at the board. "Daniel, explain the loop you mentioned." Before Daniel could answer, another delay flashed across the board. This time, it lasted almost 2 seconds. Analysts gasped softly. The pattern was accelerating. Daniel pointed toward the screen. "See the authorization codes repeating every 7th transaction?" he said. Several analysts leaned closer. One of them muttered, "Wait, that shouldn't repeat." Daniel nodded. "It's piggybacking on legitimate transfers. Every cycle hides another set of unauthorized withdrawals." "How much money are we talking about?" Omar asked. Daniel's eyes followed the scrolling digits. "If the loop completes," he said quietly, "millions." The number hit the room like thunder. Caroline Drake turned pale. "That's absurd," she snapped. "Our analysts would have detected something that large." Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he watched the next set of numbers appear. The delay grew again. 3 seconds now. "Your analysts probably are detecting something," he said softly. "They just don't know what they're seeing yet." Another alarm shrieked upstairs. Phones began ringing throughout the lobby as employees received frantic calls from other branches. Victor Halbrook exhaled slowly. For the first time since arriving, he looked less like a confident executive and more like a man calculating risk. "How long before the system collapses?" he asked. Daniel studied the board carefully. "Depends how fast the loop spreads," he said. "And if no one stops it?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Then regulators freeze every account connected to the breach." A murmur of alarm rippled through the executives. That outcome would cripple the bank overnight. Caroline Drake suddenly looked much less certain than she had earlier behind the loan desk. Halbrook turned fully toward Daniel now. "You said you've seen this exploit before." Daniel nodded. "Something like it." The bank owner studied him for several seconds. "You realize," Halbrook said slowly, "if you're wrong, you're interfering in a situation far beyond your job description." Daniel met his gaze calmly. "I know." Another delay flashed across the screen. Longer again. Halbrook glanced back at the board, then back at Daniel. For the first time since the alarms began, the most powerful man in the building made a decision based on instinct instead of hierarchy. "All right." Daniel's finger rested lightly against the glass screen, right on a single line of code most people in the room barely understood. "Right there," he said quietly. The executives leaned closer. The transaction stream kept sliding downward, green numbers stacking over one another in an endless waterfall of financial movement. Yet once Daniel pointed it out, the flaw became impossible to ignore. A sequence repeating every 7 transactions, not identical numbers, but identical authorization patterns. One analyst frowned. "That's strange." "Not strange," Daniel corrected calmly. "Intentional." Victor Halbrook stepped beside him, eyes narrowing as he studied the board. "You're saying someone built this loop into our approval system?" Daniel nodded slightly. "They didn't build it into the approval system," he replied. "They built it around it." Another alarm burst upstairs. This time the sound was sharper, louder, no longer something customers could ignore. Conversations around the lobby faltered as people began noticing employees rushing through the corridors above. Omar Castillo lifted his radio again. "Operations. Status." Static crackled. Then a strained voice came through. "Transaction backlog spreading. We're locking accounts to contain it, but more requests keep coming through." Caroline Drake turned toward Halbrook, panic creeping into her voice. "Sir, we should move this discussion upstairs. This is an internal matter." Halbrook didn't move. His eyes stayed on the maintenance worker. Daniel had already shifted his attention back to the board. His gaze moved with the numbers as though he were listening to a rhythm hidden beneath them. Because he was. Years ago, patterns like this had been his entire career. Fraud networks rarely attacked systems directly. That was too obvious. Instead, they studied infrastructure until they found tiny behavioral cracks. Cracks no one else noticed. Then they slipped through them. Another delay struck the board. 3 seconds, then 4. An analyst whispered, "It's accelerating." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "because the system thinks these are legitimate transfers." Caroline Drake's patience snapped. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "Our fraud detection algorithms monitor every transaction path." Daniel didn't even turn toward her. "That's the problem. What do you mean that's the problem?" she demanded. He finally looked back at her. "Your system only watches for unauthorized pathways." The analysts exchanged confused glances. "So?" one asked. Daniel gestured toward the screen. "This attack uses authorized ones." The realization spread slowly through the room, like dominoes tipping. One analyst suddenly leaned closer to the board. "Wait, if that's true..." He typed rapidly on the tablet in his hand. Lines of internal monitoring data appeared across the display. The analyst's face drained of color. "Oh no," Caroline Drake snapped her head toward him. "What?" He swallowed. "The validation server thinks these transfers are coming from approved internal partners." Silence hit the lobby. Victor Halbrook spoke first. "How many partners?" The analyst checked the numbers again. 7. Daniel nodded. "Exactly." Omar crossed his arms slowly. "So the fraud's hiding behind trusted connections." "Not hiding," Daniel corrected. "Camouflaging." Another alarm burst through the ceiling speakers. This time the sound carried a low, pulsing tone that made several employees upstairs shout instructions. Phones began ringing again. Halbrook's voice dropped lower. "If this continues, how long before regulators detect it?" Daniel watched the next delay ripple across the board. "Maybe 20 minutes," he said quietly. The number sucked the air from the room. Caroline Drake turned pale again. 20 minutes? She repeated. Daniel nodded. "Once federal monitors see the pattern, they'll freeze every account linked to the breach." Which means Omar started. "The entire bank," Daniel finished. For a moment, no one spoke. Customers in the lobby were starting to notice something was wrong now. A few had begun whispering while watching executives cluster around the transaction board. Victor Halbrook studied Daniel again. His instincts were screaming something unusual was happening. A maintenance technician standing calmly in the center of a financial crisis wasn't normal. And yet the man had predicted every development so far. Halbrook leaned slightly closer. "You seem very familiar with this kind of exploit." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was studying the board again. Because something new had appeared. Another sequence repeating inside the loop. Smaller. But faster. His eyes sharpened. "That's clever." Halbrook followed his gaze. "What?" Daniel pointed again. "They're testing your response speed." Caroline Drake frowned. "Testing?" "Yes," Daniel said. "If you shut down the wrong gateway first, the entire fraud network disappears before you can trace it." The analysts exchanged alarmed looks. "So, if we react incorrectly," one whispered, "we lose the trail." Daniel nodded once. "And the money?" A heavy silence filled the room again. Halbrook straightened slowly. "Then tell us the right move." Daniel hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because stepping forward now meant revealing far more than he had intended. For years he had kept his past buried. Kept his life simple. Maintenance shifts. Doctor appointments. Lily's quiet laughter at home. But the board flickered again. And the loop expanded. Millions of dollars moving invisibly through the bank's bloodstream. Daniel looked at the executives surrounding him, then at the security guard who had asked the first honest question, then finally at Victor Halbrook. First, he said calmly, "You stop watching the transactions." Halbrook frowned. What? Daniel turned fully toward the operations elevators. Because the real breach, he gestured toward the upper floors, is happening in your validation servers. And somewhere upstairs, a system alarm suddenly changed from warning to critical. The alarm upstairs shifted into a harsher tone, no longer a warning, but a full emergency alert. Several employees in the lobby froze mid-step. What was that? Someone whispered. Omar Castillo lifted his radio quickly. Operations floor, confirm status. Static crackled, followed by frantic voices overlapping each other. Validation server overload. Transactions duplicating across partner nodes. We're losing containment. The radio went dead again. Victor Halbrook's expression hardened. Daniel had already started walking toward the elevators. Not hurried, not panicked, just steady. Caroline Drake blinked in disbelief as the maintenance worker passed her desk. Excuse me, she snapped. Where exactly do you think you're going? He stopped beside the elevator panel. To your servers, he said simply. You're not authorized anywhere near, then someone who is authorized should come with me, he replied calmly. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Halbrook stepped inside first. The decision surprised everyone, including Caroline Drake. Sir? She said. Halbrook didn't look back. If the man understands the problem, I want to hear the solution. Daniel entered the elevator quietly. Omar followed a second later, radio still in hand. Caroline hesitated only a moment before stepping in as well. The doors closed. For a few seconds, the elevator rose in silence. The quiet hum of cables pulling them upward filled the small space. Caroline crossed her arms. I still don't understand why we're entertaining this, she said coldly. Daniel watched the floor numbers climb. Because the breach isn't in your transaction logs, and you know that, how? He glanced at the reflection of the numbers on the metal wall, because whoever built the loop understands banking infrastructure better than most software engineers. Omar frowned slightly. That sounds like an inside job. Not necessarily, Daniel replied. Just someone who used to work inside systems like this. Halbrook studied him carefully. You keep speaking like you've seen this before. Daniel didn't answer. The elevator doors opened onto the operations floor. Chaos greeted them. Phones rang endlessly. Analysts hurried between workstations while screens flashed warning indicators across the entire wall of monitors. A massive digital map of transaction flows flickered violently as delays spread across the network. Sir. One analyst shouted when he saw Halbrook. We've got validation queues backing up across every regional branch. Caroline stepped forward quickly. Why hasn't the system isolated the breach? We tried, the analyst replied. But every gateway we shut down creates another loop somewhere else. Daniel walked slowly toward the central monitoring screen. The room barely noticed him. To them, he was just another building worker standing in the wrong place. But the data on the screen told him everything he needed. Rows of authentication requests stacked on top of each other like traffic in a city with no functioning lights. He studied the pattern for several seconds. Then he spoke quietly. You shut down Gateway 3. The analyst turned. Yes, that was your first mistake. Caroline scoffed. Our engineers made that call based on risk containment, Daniel nodded. And that's exactly what the attackers expected. Omar leaned closer. Why? Daniel pointed to a cluster of glowing red transaction lines. Because Gateway 3 connects to your European partners. The analyst's face went pale. Which means, he whispered. Daniel finished the thought. You just redirected the loop into a faster channel. Several analysts began typing frantically. One of them shouted, He's right. The European node just spiked. Caroline stared at Daniel. How did you know that? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the main terminal. "Show me the validation queue." The analyst hesitated. Caroline opened her mouth to protest, but Halbrook raised a hand. Let him see it. The data appeared on the screen. Daniel studied the numbers quickly. 15 seconds. That's all it took. Then he exhaled slowly. "This is worse than I thought." Omar crossed his arms. "How bad?" Daniel pointed to a section of the screen most people had ignored. "Your system isn't just validating transactions." The analyst frowned. "Of course it is." Daniel shook his head. "It's validating identities." The room went silent again. Halbrook stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Daniel turned toward him. "It means the attackers aren't stealing money directly." Another alarm blared. The validation queue doubled in size. Daniel's voice stayed calm. "They're rewriting account credentials." The analyst gasped. "That's impossible." Daniel pointed at the screen again. "Look closer." They did, and suddenly the pattern became horrifyingly clear. User IDs were shifting, authorization levels changing, accounts rewriting themselves. Caroline Drake stepped back. "My God." Halbrook's voice was low. "If they finish this process." Daniel nodded. "They won't just steal money." He looked around the room filled with blinking monitors. "They'll own your entire banking system." The analysts froze. Omar muttered under his breath, "How the hell do we stop that?" Daniel stepped forward toward the keyboard. His fingers hovered above the controls. For a brief moment he hesitated. Then he said quietly, "You stop it by shutting down the one gateway they think you'll never touch." Halbrook narrowed his eyes. "Which one?" Daniel tapped a blinking node on the network map, the central authorization hub, the one system that connected every branch, the heart of the entire bank. "You shut down this one," Daniel said. "And if we're wrong?" Halbrook asked carefully. Daniel met his gaze. "Then the entire bank goes offline." The room went still after those words. Dozens of analysts stared at the blinking authorization hub Daniel had pointed to. The node pulsed red at the center of the network map, feeding every branch, every ATM, every transaction flowing through Halbrook National Bank. Shut that down, and the entire bank would stop breathing. Caroline Drake recovered first. "That's insane," she said sharply. "If we disconnect the central hub, we shut down every financial service we operate." Daniel didn't move his hand from the console. "Yes." "And you're suggesting we do that voluntarily?" "Yes." Her laugh came out tight and incredulous. "You have no authority to recommend something that catastrophic." Victor Halbrook hadn't spoken yet. He stood behind Daniel watching the screen with the focus of someone weighing risks measured in billions. "Explain," Halbrook said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "The attack is rewriting authorization credentials," he said, "but it needs constant validation from this hub to make those changes permanent." One of the analysts leaned closer. "So if the hub stops responding..." "The loop collapses," Daniel finished. Omar Castillo frowned. "But every branch goes offline, too." Daniel didn't deny it. "Temporarily," the analyst swallowed. "And if the attackers built a backup route?" Daniel finally turned toward them. "Then your bank is already lost." Silence pressed down across the operations floor. Phones continued ringing. Alerts flashed across monitors. Somewhere a printer spat out pages of error reports. Caroline Drake looked from the screens to Halbrook. "Sir, this is reckless. Our engineers are still isolating the breach." One of the analysts muttered quietly, "They're not isolating anything." Daniel watched the network map again. The validation queue was growing faster now. Nodes flickered from yellow to red. 5 minutes, he said softly. Halbrook looked at him. "Until what?" "Until the attackers gain administrative override." The words carried weight, because everyone in that room knew what administrative override meant. Complete control. The analyst at the console wiped sweat from his forehead. If that happens, your entire banking system belongs to them, Daniel said. Caroline's voice dropped. You're basing all of this on pattern recognition. Daniel nodded. That's how exploits like this work. Halbrook studied him for several seconds. Where did you learn to recognize them? Daniel didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked back at the screen. Another authorization rewrite flashed across the system. The room seemed to breathe faster. Halbrook exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Caroline's head snapped toward him. Sir, if the maintenance technician is correct, Halbrook continued, doing nothing destroys the bank anyway. The analyst's hands hovered above the console. You want me to shut down the central hub? Halbrook didn't hesitate. Prepare the command. Caroline stepped forward quickly. This is unbelievable. We're taking operational advice from someone who cleans our floors. Daniel didn't respond to the insult. But Omar did. Right now, the security supervisor said quietly, he's the only one explaining the attack. Caroline glared at both of them. Meanwhile, the analyst typed rapidly. Lines of shutdown commands appeared across the terminal. System will require executive override, he said nervously. Halbrook stepped closer. Do it. Another alarm rang out. The authorization queue tripled in size. Daniel's voice remained calm. Wait. The analyst froze. What now? Daniel pointed to a secondary node near the hub. You shut down that relay first. The analyst blinked. Why? Daniel leaned slightly closer to the screen. Because if the attackers see the hub shutting down before the relay drops, he tapped the node. They'll reroute through this one. Omar let out a low whistle. That's sneaky. Daniel nodded. They're very good. Caroline stared at him again. You talk like you've built systems like this yourself. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he focused on the network map again. The delay between validation cycles had grown to nearly 6 seconds now. Time was running out. The analyst looked at Halbrook. Command ready, Halbrook folded his arms. Execute. Before the analyst pressed the key, Daniel spoke again. One more thing. Caroline groaned. What now? Daniel looked at the massive network diagram stretching across the wall. When the hub goes offline, he said quietly, every branch will panic. Phones would explode with calls. Customers would think the bank collapsed. Executives would demand answers. Halbrook watched him carefully. And? Daniel met his eyes. And you'll need someone who understands exactly what just happened. A brief silence followed. Halbrook nodded slowly. We'll worry about explanations later. The analyst pressed the key. Across the entire operations floor, the central hub flashed, red, yellow, then black. For a split second, nothing happened. No alarms, no movement, just silence. Then every monitor in the room went dark at once. The bank had just stopped breathing. If you're enjoying this story so far, subscribe with the bell on, because the quietest person in the room is about to change everything. 5 seconds passed. 6. 7. Then suddenly one analyst shouted. The loop collapsed. The shout cut through the dark operations floor like a spark in dry grass. Screens across the room flickered back to life one by one. Systems rebooted in cascading waves as the central hub reset itself. Analysts leaned forward over their terminals, fingers racing across keyboards as they tried to confirm what had just happened. Omar Castillo let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. You actually did it, he muttered. Daniel didn't celebrate. He was already watching the validation queue as the system reinitialized. Numbers reappeared slowly, rebuilding the bank's digital bloodstream one connection at a time. Victor Halbrook stepped closer to the screen. Report. The analyst at the console checked his data rapidly. Unauthorized loops are gone, he said. Partner nodes are reconnecting, one at a time. Another analyst added, credential rewrite attempts stopped completely. Relief rippled through the room. But Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the monitor. "Don't celebrate yet," he said quietly. Caroline Drake crossed her arms again. "Why not? The system's recovering." Daniel shook his head. "No," he replied calmly. "The system is resetting. The difference mattered." The analysts continued scanning their terminals. One of them suddenly stiffened. "Wait." Halbrook turned. "What is it?" The analyst's voice dropped. "There's still something inside the validation queue." Caroline stepped forward quickly. "That's impossible." The hub reset cleared everything. Daniel leaned slightly toward the screen. "Not everything." He pointed to a cluster of blinking entries buried deep in the transaction history. There, the analyst zoomed in. A series of accounts appeared. Dormant. Unremarkable. Until the authorization field opened, the room went silent again. Because those accounts were now listed under administrative control. Omar's eyebrows lifted. Those weren't admin accounts before. Daniel nodded. "That's the second phase." Caroline's voice tightened. "Second phase?" Daniel exhaled slowly. The loop wasn't just stealing money. He tapped the screen again. It was rewriting permissions. Halbrook studied the monitor carefully. "How many accounts are affected?" The analyst typed quickly. 32. Another analyst spoke up. "They're scattered across different branches." Omar frowned. "Meaning what?" Daniel answered without looking away from the data. "Meaning the attackers wanted distributed control." Caroline shook her head in disbelief. "So even after shutting down the hub, they still left themselves keys," Daniel finished. The operations floor felt colder now. Because the crisis wasn't finished, not even close. Halbrook's voice remained steady. "How long before they activate those accounts?" Daniel scanned the timestamps. They already tried. He pointed to a failed login attempt. During the reset, the analyst swallowed, so what stopped them? Daniel gave a small nod toward the central hub. The shutdown interrupted the credential rewrite. Omar rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Meaning, they'll try again?" "Yes." "How soon?" Daniel studied the clock in the corner of the screen. "Soon enough that we don't have time for a committee meeting." A few analysts actually laughed nervously. Caroline did not. "What exactly are you suggesting now?" Daniel leaned slightly closer to the keyboard. "We trace the origin node." The analyst blinked. "You think the attackers are still connected?" Daniel nodded. "They have to be." Halbrook stepped beside him. "Why?" "Because they're waiting to see if their exploit survived the reset." Omar tilted his head. "So they're watching the system?" Daniel's voice stayed calm. "Exactly." The security supervisor cracked a slow grin. "So we watch them back." Daniel nodded once. "That's the idea." Caroline still looked skeptical. "Tracing a live exploit through international financial networks could take hours." Daniel shook his head. "Not if you follow the loop backwards." The analyst stared at him. "You can do that?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he began typing. His fingers moved across the keyboard with quiet precision, not the uncertain pecking of someone unfamiliar with the system, but the smooth rhythm of someone who had done this before. Years ago. Lines of command prompts appeared across the terminal. The analysts leaned closer. Omar watched Daniel's hands carefully. "You've done this kind of tracing before," he said quietly. Daniel didn't look up. "Something like it." Caroline frowned. "You're remarkably confident for someone whose job description involves mops and ceiling tiles." Daniel kept typing. The trace program expanded across the screen. A map of transaction pathways began rebuilding itself, layer by layer, node by node. Then suddenly a single blinking route appeared. One server, one location. The analyst gasped. "We've got a signal." Halbrook leaned forward. Where? The analyst zoomed in on the trace origin. His eyes widened. That can't be right. Daniel stopped typing. What? The analyst turned the monitor slightly so everyone could see. The trace path ended at a secure financial gateway. Not overseas, not in another country, but inside the same city. Omar read the label on the server connection slowly. Halbrook, Partner Validation Hub. Caroline went pale. That's one of our own partner banks. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, he pointed to the server address again. Look closer. The analyst expanded the location data. The room fell silent. Because the origin wasn't another bank. It was a private financial server, registered to a company located 3 blocks away inside the same financial district. Daniel leaned back from the keyboard. They didn't hack your system from the outside, he said quietly. They walked in through the front door. Halbrook's voice dropped. Who owns that server? The analyst pulled up the registration file. His expression shifted from confusion to shock. Well, that's interesting. Halbrook's eyes narrowed. Interesting how? The analyst swallowed. It's registered to one of our highest-tier investment clients. The words hung in the operations room like a sudden drop in temperature. One of our highest-tier investment clients, the analyst repeated. Victor Halbrook leaned forward slightly. Which one? The analyst hesitated, scanning the registration details again as if hoping he had misread them. Blackridge Strategic Holdings. Several executives around the room exchanged uneasy glances. Even Omar Castillo recognized the name. That's the hedge fund that moved $500 million through this bank last year, he said quietly. Caroline Drake straightened instantly. That's impossible, she said. Blackridge is one of our most trusted institutional clients. Daniel didn't speak yet. He watched the trace route carefully as the connection pulsed faintly on the screen. Trusted. That word always appeared before the biggest failures. Halbrook's voice remained steady. Explain how their server connects to this exploit. The analyst zoomed in further on the pathway. It's running through an approved financial gateway, the same one their investment software uses for bulk transfers. Daniel nodded slightly. That's how the loop entered the system. Caroline shook her head firmly. No. Their transfers are audited. They go through our compliance verification. Daniel finally turned toward her. Yes, he said calmly. And that's exactly why the exploit worked. Omar frowned. Because no one questions a trusted partner? Daniel nodded. Exactly. The operations floor hummed with quiet tension as analysts kept monitoring the system recovery. The hub had restarted successfully, but the trace line remained active. Whoever had initiated the exploit was still connected to the bank's network. Watching. Waiting. Halbrook crossed his arms slowly. If that server belongs to Blackridge, we contact them immediately. Daniel shook his head. No. The single word stopped the room again. Caroline glared at him. You're not in a position to overrule the bank owner. Daniel didn't react to the sharp tone. If you contact them now, he said quietly, the exploit disappears. The analyst nodded reluctantly. He's right. If the attackers see us investigating the source, they'll shut down the connection instantly. Halbrook's gaze returned to the trace monitor. So we observe first. Daniel nodded. Exactly. Omar tilted his head slightly, meaning we let them think their attack still worked. A faint smile touched Daniel's expression. That's the idea. Caroline still looked skeptical. And what exactly does that accomplish? Daniel pointed to the blinking connection. Right now they're checking whether the credential rewrites survived the reset. Another analyst confirmed it. I'm seeing repeated authentication pings. Daniel nodded. They're testing the door. Halbrook leaned closer. And if they realize the door is closed? Daniel met his eyes calmly. They'll try another one. The implication settled across the room. Another attack attempt meant another trace opportunity. Caroline exhaled slowly. You're suggesting we bait them, yes? Omar chuckled softly. I like this guy. Daniel ignored the comment and turned back to the keyboard. Reopen the partner gateway, he instructed the analyst. The analyst blinked. Wouldn't that give them access again? Daniel shook his head. Not if we isolate the channel. He typed a quick set of commands. A sandbox network appeared on the monitoring display, a contained environment designed to trap suspicious traffic. The analysts leaned closer. You built a digital decoy, one said quietly. Daniel nodded. Now when they probe the gateway, they'll think the system is still vulnerable. Halbrook studied the setup carefully. And we trace the response. Exactly. Omar folded his arms. So, we're basically setting a trap. Daniel allowed himself a small nod. That's another way to describe it. Caroline watched him work with growing confusion. The calm precision in his movements no longer matched the image she had of a maintenance technician. His commands flowed through the system like someone who understood its architecture intimately. Not someone guessing. Someone remembering. She spoke slowly. You said earlier you've seen exploits like this before. Daniel didn't look up from the keyboard. Yes. Caroline narrowed her eyes. Where exactly? For a moment the room seemed to pause again. Daniel's fingers slowed slightly over the keys. Then he answered simply. In another life, the trace monitor blinked suddenly. A new signal entered the sandbox gateway. Omar leaned forward. Looks like the fish just bit. The analysts watched the incoming traffic expand across the map. Connection attempts multiplied. Authorization probes. Credential tests. Every move the attackers made now passed through Daniel's trap. One analyst whispered, they're scanning the system again. Daniel nodded. Good. Halbrook glanced at him. Good? Yes, Daniel said calmly. Because the more they move, the easier it is to see where they really are. The trace lines shifted across the digital map, from the partner gateway to a secondary server, then another. The analysts followed the trail with widening eyes. One of them suddenly gasped. That's not just one server. Daniel watched the expanding network carefully. No, he said quietly. It's an entire cluster. Omar leaned closer. Meaning? Daniel pointed to the screen. Meaning whoever built this exploit didn't act alone. Halbrook's voice dropped. How many people are we dealing with? Daniel counted the nodes forming on the map, then answered softly. Enough to take down a bank, and as the final trace line locked into place, the room finally saw where the attack was truly coming from. Enough to take down a bank. The words lingered in the air as the digital map finished drawing itself across the massive operations screen. More nodes appeared. Not one attacker. Not two. A coordinated cluster of servers linked together through financial proxies and validation relays. The analysts stared at the network in stunned silence. One of them finally spoke. This isn't a lone hacker. Daniel shook his head slowly. No. Omar let out a low whistle. That's a full operation. Victor Halbrook folded his arms, studying the expanding web of connections. How many active nodes? The analyst checked the data feed. 6 confirmed, maybe 7. Caroline Drake stepped closer to the screen. But they're still routing through Blackridge's gateway, Daniel nodded. That's their shield, Omar frowned, meaning Blackridge might not even know this is happening. Exactly, Daniel replied. The sandbox network continued capturing incoming probes from the attackers. Each attempt revealed a little more of their structure. Daniel leaned toward the keyboard again. Now we slow them down. The analyst blinked. Slow them? Daniel typed several commands. Instantly, the sandbox gateway began responding to the attackers with subtle delays, not enough to trigger suspicion, just enough to stretch their timeline. "Why do that?" Omar asked. "Because if they think the exploit still works," Daniel said quietly, "they'll eventually try to move the money." Caroline crossed her arms again. "And that helps us how?" Daniel pointed to the trace map. "Because moving the money requires authorization from the control server." The analysts leaned forward. "That's the one we really want," one said. Daniel nodded. "The brain." Victor Halbrook studied him carefully. "You're confident they'll activate it." "They always do," Daniel said. Greed eventually overrides caution. Another ping flashed across the sandbox gateway. Then another. The attackers were probing deeper now, testing permissions, searching for access. Omar glanced between the monitors and Daniel. "You're oddly calm for someone standing in the middle of a banking cyber attack." Daniel didn't look up. Panicking wouldn't help. Caroline muttered under her breath. That confidence again. The analysts continued monitoring the trap Daniel had created. Suddenly, one of them straightened. New node connecting. Everyone leaned close. A fresh signal appeared on the trace map. This one stronger, more stable. Daniel's eyes sharpened instantly. "There it is." Halbrook looked at him. "The control server?" Daniel nodded slowly. "That's the command node." The analyst zoomed in on the connection. A secure private server, running through multiple encryption layers. But the location field still appeared. Omar read it aloud. "Financial district, 3 blocks south." Caroline blinked. "That's still inside our city." Daniel nodded. They stayed close. Halbrook frowned. "Why would anyone launch an attack like this from the same district as the bank?" Daniel leaned back slightly. Because proximity gives faster access, the analysts watched the command node carefully. The attackers were preparing something. Authorization scripts began loading. Transaction packets queued up behind the control server. Omar rubbed his chin. "Looks like they're getting ready to move money." Daniel nodded. "That's the final stage." Halbrook's voice remained steady. "And when they do?" Daniel tapped the keyboard again. "When they do, we catch them." Caroline looked skeptical. "They're hiding behind encrypted servers and financial gateways. Catching them isn't exactly simple." Daniel met her gaze calmly. "No," then he pointed at the trace map. "But they made one mistake." Omar leaned closer. "What mistake?" Daniel highlighted the control node. They logged in. The analyst's eyes widened. "Which means," Daniel finished the thought, "we now have their authentication signature." The room fell silent, because an authentication signature could identify the operator behind the attack, not just the server, the person. Halbrook's attention sharpened. "You can trace that?" Daniel nodded slowly. With the right access, Caroline crossed her arms again. "And what exactly counts as the right access?" Daniel glanced toward the executive terminal across the room, the one reserved for senior administrators. "You'll need full executive authorization." Halbrook didn't hesitate. "You have it." Caroline turned toward him in disbelief. "Sir, we're giving system authority to a building maintenance worker." Halbrook looked at Daniel, then back at the screens showing the captured attack. "At the moment," he said quietly, "he's the only person who understands the battlefield." Daniel stepped toward the executive terminal. For the first time since the crisis began, every analyst in the room watched him with genuine curiosity. Not dismissal, not confusion, respect. Before the story continues, subscribe with the bell on, because the quietest man in this building is about to expose the people who thought they could steal a bank. Daniel sat down at the terminal. His fingers moved across the keyboard again. Command prompts opened. Authentication trace tools launched. Within seconds, the system began unraveling the identity behind the attack. The analysts leaned forward. One whispered softly, "This guy definitely didn't learn this fixing air vents." Daniel didn't respond. He was already watching the trace lines converge. Because somewhere inside that web of encrypted connections, someone had just revealed their identity. And the name about to appear on the screen would shock everyone in the room. The trace program narrowed its focus. Lines of encrypted data unraveled across the executive terminal as Daniel guided the system deeper into the command node. Each layer peeled back another piece of the attacker's infrastructure. The analysts crowded closer behind him. One whispered, "Authentication signature locked." Daniel nodded slightly. "Now we follow the handshake." Omar leaned against the console beside him. "Meaning we track the login itself?" "Yes," Daniel replied. He typed another sequence of commands. The system responded instantly. A new window opened, showing the digital certificate attached to the command node. Normally, it would be hidden beneath multiple encryption layers, but because the attackers believed they were still operating inside a compromised system, they hadn't concealed everything. The certificate identifier blinked on the screen. Halbrook stepped forward. "What does that tell us?" Daniel studied the numbers carefully. "It tells us who logged into the server." Caroline Drake crossed her arms tightly. "Or it tells us which stolen credentials they used." Daniel nodded. "That's possible." He typed another command. The system began cross-referencing the authentication key against the bank's internal partner registry. A progress bar appeared. 5%. 10. 20. The room waited in tense silence. Then the results appeared. One analyst gasped softly. "That can't be right." Halbrook leaned closer. "What is it?" The analyst turned the monitor slightly. "The certificate belongs to Blackridge Strategic Holdings." Caroline exhaled in relief. "So it is their system." Daniel shook his head. "Not exactly." He tapped the screen again. "Look at the secondary authentication." Another analyst leaned forward. "There's a personal access credential attached." Omar frowned. "A personal login?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Halbrook's voice lowered. "Name?" The analyst expanded the credential file. The name appeared slowly across the terminal. The room went quiet again. Because everyone in finance recognized it. "Evan Whitlock," the analyst read. Caroline blinked. "That's Blackridge's chief technology officer." Daniel nodded once. "He built their transaction automation software." Omar tilted his head. "So the guy who designed their banking integration used it to hack the bank." Daniel watched the data feed carefully. "Looks that way." Caroline shook her head. "No. That doesn't make sense. Whitlock manages billions in financial assets. Why would he risk everything on something like this?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "Because people who understand systems also understand how to break them." The analysts continued scanning the trace logs. Another one spoke quietly. "There's more." Halbrook looked over. "What?" "Whitlock isn't the only login." The screen expanded again. Additional authentication signatures appeared. 3 more names, all connected to Blackridge's financial engineering team. Omar let out a low whistle. "That's not just a rogue employee." Daniel nodded. "That's a coordinated operation." Caroline stared at the screen. "But Blackridge is one of our biggest clients." Halbrook's voice hardened. "Which means they also had the access." Daniel pointed to the system map again. They used legitimate integration tools to mask the exploit. The analysts began piecing together the timeline. One of them spoke slowly. "The loop started 2 hours ago during a scheduled investment transfer." Daniel nodded. "That's when the gateway opened." Omar frowned. "So they slipped the exploit inside a normal transaction?" "Yes, and waited for the system to process it." Daniel confirmed with a quiet nod. The operation was disturbingly elegant. Not brute force, not chaotic hacking, just precision. Caroline stared at Daniel. You recognized that pattern in seconds. He didn't respond. Halbrook, however, had been watching him carefully. Where did you learn to read financial systems like this? The bank owner asked quietly. Daniel's hands rested lightly on the keyboard. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said calmly, I used to design them. The analysts exchanged confused looks. Caroline's eyes narrowed. What exactly does that mean? Daniel didn't elaborate. Instead, he turned back to the trace monitor. The attackers were still active inside the sandbox network. Testing, probing, waiting. Now that we know who they are, Omar said, what's the next move? Daniel tapped the screen. Now we let them commit the crime. Caroline blinked. Excuse me? Daniel looked at the transaction queue forming behind the command node. They're preparing a transfer. The analysts confirmed it. $38 million queued across 6 accounts. Halbrook's voice remained steady. If they execute it, Daniel nodded. They expose themselves completely. Omar smiled slowly. So the trap closes. Daniel leaned forward again. Exactly. Caroline still looked uneasy. You're suggesting we let them attempt the theft? Daniel met her gaze. Yes, Halbrook studied him. And then? Daniel pointed to the transaction trigger line. When they press execute, he tapped the console. We freeze every account connected to the operation. The analyst's eyes widened. That would expose the entire fraud network, Daniel nodded. Publicly. The word hung in the air. Because that meant more than stopping a theft. It meant destroying reputations. Halbrook straightened slightly. You're talking about exposing Blackridge Strategic Holdings in the middle of a financial crime. Daniel's expression remained calm. They exposed themselves the moment they logged in. The analysts watched the command node carefully. The transfer packets were building, seconds away from execution. Omar glanced at the screen. Looks like they're about to move. Daniel rested his finger lightly over the final command key. Good, he said quietly. Let them. Daniel's finger hovered above the command key while the room held its breath. Across the giant operations screen, the transfer queue continued building. Lines of pending transactions stacked one after another, each one linked to the command node operated by Evan Whitlock and his team. $38 million. Prepared to move in one synchronized burst. Omar Castillo leaned forward beside Daniel. They're lining up the accounts, he muttered. The analyst nodded nervously. Authorization packets are forming. Looks like they're preparing a multi-branch sweep. Victor Halbrook's voice was steady but lower now. If they move that money... Daniel finished the sentence quietly. They commit the crime in real time. Caroline Drake still looked uneasy. And you're certain we can stop it before it clears? Daniel's eyes never left the monitor. Yes. How? He tapped the console lightly. Because they still think they're inside your real system. The sandbox environment he built continued responding to the attackers exactly like the bank's network would. Except every command they sent was now being recorded. Every authorization logged, every identity captured. The trap was almost ready. Another analyst leaned closer. Transfer scripts just activated. Omar whistled softly. Here we go. On the screen, 6 authorization requests appeared simultaneously, each tied to a different branch account, each requesting high-value transfers. The command node flashed green. Whitlock was executing the operation. Daniel spoke calmly. Wait. No one moved. The analysts watched the packets assemble. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The system prepared to release the transactions. Caroline's voice tightened. Shouldn't we stop them now? Daniel shook his head slightly. Not yet. Halbrook studied him carefully. You're waiting for something. Daniel nodded. The confirmation handshake. A moment later, the command node transmitted a final authentication key. The system verified the operator's identity. Evan Whitlock. Daniel exhaled softly. There, his finger dropped onto the keyboard. The command executed instantly. Across the network map, every connected account froze. Authorization privileges vanished. Transfer packets locked mid-process. The sandbox gateway slammed shut like a vault door. The analysts erupted at once. It's frozen. Transfers halted. Accounts locked. Omar laughed under his breath. Gotcha. Caroline stared at the screen in disbelief. They're completely locked out. Daniel nodded. And now the system flags every account involved. Halbrook folded his arms. What happens next? The analyst answered. Automatic fraud alert, regulatory notification, and internal audit trigger. Omar grinned. Meaning those accounts just lit up every financial watchdog in the country, Daniel added quietly. And every partner institution connected to them. Caroline's eyes widened. You've just exposed Blackridge's entire fraud network. Daniel nodded once. Yes. The command node on the screen began firing frantic connection attempts. Whitlock's team had realized something was wrong. But it was too late. Their credentials were already logged. Their accounts flagged. Their transaction scripts captured. Every move documented. Omar chuckled. Looks like they finally noticed the doors locked. Another analyst confirmed it. They're trying to disconnect the server. Daniel shook his head. Doesn't matter. Halbrook glanced at the screen. Why? Daniel tapped the trace log. Because the system already copied everything, Caroline slowly stepped back from the monitors. For the first time since the crisis began, the room was quiet again. No alarms. No flashing warnings. Just the steady hum of computers processing the aftermath. Halbrook looked at Daniel. You just stopped a $38 million theft. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back slightly in the chair. His shoulders finally relaxed. The analysts around the room were still staring at him. A maintenance worker who had just dismantled one of the most sophisticated financial attacks they had ever seen. Caroline spoke slowly. You said earlier you used to design systems like this. Daniel nodded. Yes. Halbrook's gaze sharpened. For which institution? Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he answered calmly. For several banks. Omar raised an eyebrow. Several? Daniel gave a small shrug. Fraud detection consulting. The analysts exchanged surprised looks. Caroline studied him carefully. You're telling us a banking security expert has been working maintenance shifts in our building? Daniel finally stood from the terminal. Life changes, he said simply. Halbrook watched him closely. And you came here today asking for a loan? Daniel nodded once. Yes, Caroline's expression shifted slightly. For the first time, the earlier scene in the lobby seemed to replay in her mind. The rejection. The dismissal. The envelope of loan documents. The man she had sent away. Halbrook spoke again. Why did you leave that field? Daniel hesitated briefly. Then he answered quietly. My daughter needed me more than the job did. The room grew still again. Omar nodded slowly. Fair enough. An analyst suddenly spoke up. Sir, regulatory monitors just acknowledged the fraud alert. Halbrook glanced at the screen. Meaning, they're launching a full investigation into Blackridge. Omar chuckled. That hedge fund's about to have a very bad morning. Daniel stepped away from the console. The crisis was finished. But the consequences were only beginning. Halbrook looked at him again. You saved this bank today. Daniel shook his head slightly. No. Then he glanced toward the elevator doors leading back to the lobby. I just stopped someone from stealing it. But the real confrontation was waiting downstairs. Daniel stepped away from the executive terminal, while analysts continued reviewing the captured fraud logs. The operations floor had transformed from chaos to stunned quiet. Screens now displayed stable transaction flows again, but the echo of what had nearly happened lingered in every corner of the room. Victor Halbrook looked toward the elevators. "Let's go," he said. Caroline Drake blinked. "Go where?" Halbrook's voice remained calm. "Back to the lobby." Daniel already knew why. Because the moment the bank owner walked back through those doors, the entire story would collide with what had happened earlier that morning. Omar Castillo followed behind them as the group entered the elevator. None of the analysts tried to stop them. They were too busy replaying the trace logs and watching the regulatory alerts flood into the system. The elevator doors slid shut. For a few seconds, the ride downward passed in silence. Caroline finally spoke. "This entire situation started because you walked into the bank asking for a loan." Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, and somehow you ended up dismantling a financial cyber attack." He didn't respond. Omar chuckled softly. "Funny how days work out." Caroline looked at Daniel again. "You could have walked away after I rejected your application, yes, but you stayed." Daniel's eyes rested on the elevator floor indicator. "My daughter needs treatment," he said quietly. The number dropped to the lobby level. The doors opened. The marble floor of Halbrook National Bank spread out before them again. Customers were still inside the building, though the tension had eased now that the alarms upstairs had stopped. Employees moved between desks cautiously, whispering about whatever emergency had just shaken the bank. When Victor Halbrook stepped out of the elevator, the atmosphere changed instantly. Executives at nearby desks straightened. The receptionist looked up. Even the security guard near the entrance shifted posture. But Halbrook wasn't looking at them. He was looking directly at the loan desk. Where Caroline Drake had rejected Daniel's application less than an hour earlier. A few customers nearby recognized the maintenance worker standing beside the bank owner. Some of them had been present when the rejection happened. Whispers began moving through the lobby. Halbrook walked slowly toward the desk. Caroline followed beside him, suddenly looking far less certain than before. Daniel stopped a few steps away from the counter. The same marble surface, the same paperwork tray, the same envelope he had placed there earlier. Halbrook rested his hand lightly on the desk. "Miss Drake," he said calmly. Caroline straightened automatically. "Yes, sir. I understand this gentleman applied for a loan earlier today." Her throat tightened slightly. "Yes." Halbrook glanced toward Daniel. "And you rejected the application." Caroline hesitated. Yes, several customers nearby were now openly watching the exchange. The security guard near the entrance slowly approached as well. Halbrook folded his hands calmly. "May I ask why?" Caroline forced herself to maintain composure. His financial profile didn't meet the bank's lending standards. Halbrook nodded once. "Interesting." He turned slightly toward Daniel. And yet this same applicant just saved Halbrook National Bank from a multi-million-dollar cyber theft. The lobby fell completely silent. Several customers blinked in confusion. The receptionist gasped softly. Omar leaned casually against a nearby pillar, watching the reactions ripple through the room. Caroline's composure cracked. "Sir." Halbrook raised a hand gently. $38 million, he said. "That's what our bank nearly lost." He looked around the lobby so the witnesses could hear him clearly. And the person who stopped it, he gestured toward Daniel, was the man standing here in work boots. A murmur spread across the room. Daniel shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Halbrook continued. "The maintenance technician you dismissed is a former financial fraud detection specialist." Caroline's face turned pale. Several customers whispered to each other. One man muttered, "You're kidding." Omar smiled quietly. No one was kidding. Halbrook picked up the loan envelope resting on the counter. "I believe this application deserves reconsideration." Caroline swallowed. "Yes, sir." Halbrook handed the envelope back to Daniel, but instead of placing it on the desk, he offered it respectfully. "Mr. Mercer." Daniel accepted the envelope slowly. "You didn't just protect this bank today," Halbrook said. "You protected every customer standing in this building." The customers watching nearby began nodding quietly. The security guard spoke under his breath. "Guess we misjudged you." Daniel gave a small, polite nod. Halbrook continued. "As owner of this institution, I'm authorizing immediate approval of your loan." Caroline blinked. "Immediately?" "Yes." Halbrook's voice remained firm. "And I would also like to discuss something else." Daniel looked at him. "What's that?" Halbrook smiled faintly. "How you feel about returning to the field of financial security?" Omar chuckled softly behind them. "Didn't see that coming." Halbrook extended his hand. "Because Halbrook National Bank could use someone who sees problems before the rest of us do." Daniel looked at the offered hand, then at the quiet lobby filled with witnesses. The same room where he had been dismissed only minutes earlier. He shook Halbrook's hand calmly. Not for recognition, not for pride, but because somewhere across the city, a little girl was waiting for her father to come home with good news. The handshake lasted only a moment, but everyone in the lobby saw it. Victor Halbrook, owner of one of the most powerful banks in the city, standing in front of a maintenance worker and shaking his hand with open respect. Whispers rippled through the marble hall. Some customers leaned closer to hear what had just been said. Others glanced toward Caroline Drake, whose confident posture from earlier had completely vanished. Daniel slowly withdrew his hand. "I appreciate the offer," he said calmly. Halbrook nodded. "You've earned it." Omar Castillo chuckled quietly from near the pillar. Understatement of the year. The security guard near the door spoke up too. So the guy who just saved the bank almost got turned away for asking for help? No one answered him. Because the truth of that statement hung in the air like a spotlight. Caroline Drake cleared her throat, trying to regain some control of the moment. "I'll begin processing the loan immediately." Daniel nodded politely. "That's all I came for." Several customers nearby exchanged looks. One woman shook her head. "Funny how things work out," she whispered to her husband. Halbrook turned toward Daniel again. "You understand the scale of what you stopped today, Mr. Mercer." Daniel glanced briefly toward the transaction board on the wall, the same one where he had first noticed the strange delay. "I stopped a bad decision," he said quietly. Omar laughed. $38 million is a pretty expensive decision. Daniel allowed a faint smile. Systems fail when people stop paying attention. Halbrook studied him. "And you noticed it in seconds." Daniel shrugged lightly. Old habits. Caroline returned with the loan folder, now carrying a completely different tone of urgency. "Everything is approved," she said, placing the documents carefully on the desk. The same desk where she had pushed the application away earlier. Daniel looked down at the paperwork. The approval stamp sat clearly across the top page. Lily's treatment would continue. That single fact carried more weight than every executive in the room combined. He signed the papers quietly. Caroline slid them back into the folder. "Funds will be available immediately," she said. Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Halbrook watched the exchange with thoughtful eyes. "You know," he said, "most people in your position would have enjoyed watching the bank struggle after being rejected." Daniel shook his head. that wouldn't help my daughter." The honesty in that answer silenced the room again. Omar pushed away from the pillar. "Honestly," he said, "I think that's the part everyone here should remember." Several employees nearby nodded slowly. Because the story they had just witnessed wasn't about technology. It wasn't even about money. It was about the quiet dignity of someone who refused to let humiliation turn into bitterness. Daniel picked up the loan folder. He glanced once more around the lobby, the same place where minutes earlier he had stood holding an envelope and listening to someone explain why he didn't qualify for help. Now those same witnesses watched him with respect instead of dismissal. Halbrook spoke again. "My offer stands, Mr. Mercer." Daniel looked back. "You might want someone who understands financial warfare before the next crisis arrives." Daniel considered that for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. "Maybe we'll talk." Omar grinned. "I'll take that as a yes." Daniel turned toward the front doors of the bank. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor as he stepped toward the exit. The city outside continued moving like nothing had happened. Cars passed. People hurried along sidewalks. No one out there knew how close an entire bank had come to disaster. But inside Halbrook National Bank, everyone in that lobby would remember the day a maintenance worker saved them all. Daniel stepped onto the sidewalk. He pulled out his phone. One message waited on the screen. "Lily, did it work, Dad?" Daniel typed a reply. "Yes, everything's going to be okay." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and started walking down the street, the weight on his shoulders finally lighter than it had been all morning. Because sometimes the quietest people carry the sharpest minds. And sometimes the person the world overlooks is the one holding it together. If you enjoyed this story, ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Janitor was fired for sitting in the CEO's chair. Minutes later, the CEO froze. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?